Imagine a single, completely unwashed spoon left in the kitchen sink. The stainless steel catches the overhead light, and it is, totally innocuous.
Right, just a spoon.
Exactly, just a piece of silverware. But within 45 minutes, that spoon is no longer just a spoon. It has somehow become like the central piece of evidence in a full-blown tribunal against your character, your capacity for empathy, and your fundamental worth as a partner.
It escalates incredibly fast.
It really does.
Wow.
And before we jump into why that happens and how an entire worldview has been built around that exact domestic escalation, please take a quick second to like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dives.
It is a striking scenario, though, and it's the perfect entry point into a deeply controversial and honestly provocative text today. We're looking at a 2026 ebook by Conrad Riker titled Female Neuroticism, Self-Loathing Ego Attack by BPD Negative Animus Revolt Against Natural Order.
Which is quite a title.
It is. It's an ultra-long, highly incisive structural critique of modern relationships and the institutions that govern them.
And right up front, I want to mention that if you find yourself wanting to explore this intense text for yourself after we break it down, it is available to buy right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Definitely a good resource for those who want to read the source material.
Yeah. Now, we need to state our mission and a very clear disclaimer for this deep dive. The contents of this book are highly politically charged. This text is aimed specifically at a men's rights and red-pilled manosphere audience. Riker makes these sweeping claims about our institutions being captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right, he doesn't hold back at all.
He doesn't. So, as your guides today, we are absolutely not taking sides. We are not endorsing the author's viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our goal is to impartially report on the fascinating psychological frameworks, the clinical terminologies, and the historical arguments the author uses to construct his thesis.
We are here to map out the architecture of his argument, essentially, to understand the how and the why behind his claim that subjective emotion has completely triumphed over objective reality in Western society.
To do that, we have to start where the author starts, not in the halls of government, but at the micro level, the domestic household. That spoon in the sink.
The scene of the crime, according to the book.
Exactly. The author argues that when that spoon is discovered, the partner who left it there isn't just scolded for being messy. The neurological filing cabinet is essentially emptied out, and the only file left on the table says guilty.
Yeah, the spoon becomes an indictment of an alleged pathology of neglect.
Right. It's not about chores anymore.
No, not at all. And Riker grounds this rapid escalation in clinical psychology, leaning heavily on the 1975 work of psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg, specifically his research on borderline personality organization.
Okay, so he's using clinical foundations here.
He is. The author utilizes Kernberg's concepts of identity diffusion and splitting to explain the sheer disproportion of the reaction.
Let's slow down on identity diffusion for a second, just to make sure we're clear. If I understand the clinical definition correctly, it means a psyche struggles to integrate the idea that a single person has both good and bad qualities simultaneously.
Yes, exactly.
Like a healthy person sees a partner who is loving, but sometimes forgets a chore. But in this neurotic framework, that integration just shatters.
You've hit the nail on the head. That is the essence of splitting. The individual splits the world into idealized saviors on one hand and demonized persecutors on the other.
So there's no middle ground.
None. There's no gray area. So when the man leaves the spoon in the sink, all of his historical good deeds just evaporate from the room. He transforms entirely into the bad object. The offense isn't the spoon. The offense is his fundamental existence in that moment.
Which brings in what the book calls emotional reasoning, right?
Right, exactly.
Riker describes this state where the intensity of a feeling is treated as factual proof that a crime was committed. If the partner feels fundamentally betrayed by the sight of that spoon, then betrayal is recorded as an objective historical fact.
The feeling becomes the evidence.
Yeah, the feeling isn't a signal to maybe investigate or ask a question. It operates as a final verdict.
And that framework is completely immune to logic. Riker calls this the private law of feeling. Inside this private law, presenting evidence is seen as an attack.
It sounds like playing a sport where the referee fundamentally changes the rules mid-game, based purely on the crowd's mood.
That's a great way to picture it.
And then, when you pull out the old rule book to show you didn't commit a foul, you get penalized just for holding the book.
You get a foul for reading the rules.
Right. So if a man is caught in this shifting reality, logic says he should just produce the receipts, show that he did the dishes the last 5 nights. But Riker strictly forbids that, doesn't he?
He does. He's very clear on this. Riker introduces a clinical shorthand rule for his audience, stock JEs.
JDE. Right.
Yes. Do not justify, argue, defend, or explain. The author's reasoning here is that in the private law of feeling, a man's conscientious instinct to clarify actually feeds the prosecution.
Because if you explain yourself, you are implicitly suggesting her feelings are disconnected from reality.
That is the trap right there. If you justify, you are invalidating her reality, which she experiences as a form of gaslighting or aggression.
Wow.
Yeah, and if you defend yourself, well, you're simply proving you have something to hide. It is a closed loop.
So there's no way out using logic.
None. The harder the man tries to anchor the argument in objective facts, the more he proves, in her emotional reasoning anyway, that he is cold, calculating, and abusive.
Okay, so if defending yourself logically only makes things worse, we really have to look at the underlying engine driving this behavior. The book transitions from the observable argument in the kitchen to the deep, unconscious mechanics of the mind. And Riker brings in Carl Jung to explain this, right?
He does, yeah. He specifically leans on Jung's concept of the animus.
Which is what exactly, for those who don't know?
So, in Jungian psychology, the animus is the masculine principle within the female psyche, which is supposed to provide reasoned judgment and objective clarity. But Riker posits that in a neurotic state, this principle inverts. It curdles into a negative animus.
The author describes it as a parasitic, hostile, internal masculine voice, almost like a tireless prosecutor that lives in her own mind, constantly berating her, feeding on her unintegrated shame.
Exactly. It's an internal attacker.
But because she can't tolerate the weight of that internal shame, she has to export it. She has to find somewhere else to put it.
Which is where Riker weaves in the clinical concepts of Melanie Klein and Wilfred Bion. He focuses heavily on projective identification.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Sure. So this is a step beyond simple projection. Simple projection is just thinking someone else feels what you feel. But projective identification is an active interpersonal process.
It's like a game of hot potato, but with a live grenade of shame.
That is a very accurate metaphor for how the book describes it.
The author argues that this internal parasite takes her intolerable feelings and throws them onto the male partner. But she doesn't just blame him. She actively provokes him, picking at him until he finally snaps and gets frustrated or angry.
All right, she needs him to act it out.
And the moment he raises his voice, she points to him and says, "See, you are the angry one. You are the abusive one."
That is the crucial identification part of the process. She forces him to metabolize the very emotions she cannot tolerate within herself. And the tragedy, as Riker frames it, is that the man usually absorbs this guilt.
Why does he absorb it?
Because he loves her, and he operates under the assumption that there must be a rational reason she's this upset, so he takes on the burden of fixing it.
So he essentially becomes a human emotional kidney, tasked with filtering her psychological toxins.
An emotional kidney, yes.
But let's say the man reads this book, realizes he's being used as a filter, and decides to just step back. What happens if he refuses to process those emotions and simply sets a boundary?
Oh, the author warns his readers that setting a boundary will trigger an immediate defense mechanism known clinically as DARVO.
Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender.
Precisely. Because if he refuses to play the villain in her internal movie, she is suddenly stuck holding that grenade of shame again.
She has to feel her own feelings, which is the one thing she's trying to avoid.
That is the core of it. Riker claims that the negative animus views the man's autonomy, his refusal to absorb the projection, as a profound betrayal.
Wow.
Yeah, the moment he steps back, he isn't seen as a person setting a healthy boundary. He is attacked for being cold, controlling, and abandoning her in her time of need. His independence is literally framed as abuse.
It's a completely inescapable labyrinth if you try to navigate it using standard relationship advice. But here is where the deep dive takes a fascinating turn. The author argues that this neurotic structure cannot survive in isolation.
Right, it needs fuel.
It doesn't just need a male target to filter the shame.
Yeah.
It needs an audience to validate its existence. And that introduces the concept he calls the costume rack.
This is a major pivot in the book, moving the analysis from internal emotional projection to the adoption of external ideologies. Riker attempts to explain how identity diffusion manifests publicly in the modern world.
He paints this vivid picture of a woman standing in front of her closet, but instead of picking out a dress for the evening, she is picking out an entirely new self.
An ideological outfit, basically.
Exactly. The book provides examples of a person swapping core identities practically overnight. Like, on Tuesday, She might be a traditional homemaker baking sourdough on Instagram. By Friday, because a new algorithm kicks in or she joins a new social clique, she is suddenly a militant anti-capitalist, or perhaps a sex-positive empowerment coach.
It's intellectual whiplash.
It is, and the author asserts this isn't genuine growth. It is a rapid-fire rotation based entirely on what the audience of the moment will reward.
Riker's argument is that underneath all these rotating outfits, there is, as he puts it, one empty peg where a stable identity ought to hang. The person lacks a foundational core, so they just borrow one from the culture.
And technology plays a big part in this, right?
A huge part. He argues that modern technology, specifically smartphones and algorithm-driven social media, has supercharged this vulnerability. The constant influx of new digital audiences demands a constant rotation of new moral costumes to secure validation.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, though. Changing your mind is a fundamental part of the human experience. People read new books, they evolve, they might get into traditional baking one month and then start reading Marxist theory the next. How is Riker distinguishing between normal, healthy intellectual curiosity and someone just pulling a costume off the rack for social survival?
It's a fair question, and Riker actually anticipates that exact criticism. He addresses it with a concept he calls the mirror test.
The mirror test.
Yeah, he argues you can always spot a borrowed costume by its complete lack of foundational logic. If you ask a person who has genuinely evolved their worldview to explain their stance, they can walk you through the chain of reasoning that led them there.
They can explain the why.
Yes, exactly. But if you apply the mirror test to someone wearing a costume, if you ask them to define their terms from first principles without relying on quoting a podcaster, a TikTok reel, or a therapist's buzzwords, the argument instantly collapses.
They just don't have the depth to back it up.
They cannot defend the ideology because they never actually reasoned their way into it. They absorbed it via social contagion. And Riker points out that the moment the audience changes, the ideology vanishes without a trace.
That makes the distinction incredibly clear. So we have this psychological dynamic operating in the home with the spoon in the sink, and we see it operating online with the costume rack. Now, the book scales this entire framework up to its central, most controversial thesis.
This is where he goes macro.
Right. Riker claims that this domestic dysfunction hasn't stayed confined to personal relationships. It has metastasized and successfully captured the major institutions of Western society.
He argues that the household constitution has essentially gone federal. The private law of feeling has become the public law of the state. He calls this mechanism the gamma exchange.
The gamma exchange is the engine of his societal critique, so we really need to look closely at how it supposedly operates. Riker outlines a specific three-step pipeline. First, emotional instability is culturally relabeled as vulnerability.
Okay.
Second, that vulnerability is granted institutional protection. And third, that institutional protection is converted into raw institutional power.
To see how that plays out in reality, Riker traces the gamma exchange through corporate HR departments, family courts, and university campuses. A prime example he uses is the American university system.
He focuses heavily on Title IX, right?
Yes, specifically focusing on the 2011 and 2014 Dear Colleague letters issued by the Department of Education regarding Title IX sexual misconduct tribunals.
Those were the guidelines that required universities to lower the burden of proof to a mere preponderance of evidence, meaning a campus tribunal only had to find it 51% likely that an offense occurred to expel a student.
51%. Riker highlights that as a pivotal moment of institutional capture. He argues this mandate stripped the accused of centuries of basic due process, denying them legal counsel, denying the right to cross-examination, and in some cases denying them knowledge of the specific charges until right before the hearing.
The author's perspective is that the state internalized the exact logic of the borderline domestic mood court. In these tribunals, the accuser is presumed fragile, and therefore their emotional distress is treated as factual truth.
Just like the spoon in the sink.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the accused is presumed powerful, and therefore their demand for evidence or due process is treated as a further act of aggression.
He argues that the therapy industry acts as the crucial middleman in this exchange. Riker describes modern therapy culture not as a place of clinical healing, but as a system that acts as a notary for the negative animus.
A notary laundering subjective grievances into institutional authority. That is quite a phrase.
It is, but it's precisely the mechanism he describes. Therapists, in his view, provide clinical-sounding vocabulary for personal mood swings, giving them the weight of objective trauma without ever demanding objective evidence.
And then they take that paperwork to HR.
Exactly. This language is taken to HR, or the courts, where the stable male employee who asks for clear metrics is penalized for lacking empathy or warmth. But the employee who has public emotional meltdowns is provided with executive coaches, accommodations, and protection.
It really is the spoon in the sink scaled up to a corporate and federal level. The state rewards the fog of emotional chaos and punishes the mountain of male stability. But how did the institutions become so vulnerable to this in the first place? Riker points the finger at philosophy, right?
He traces the vulnerability straight back to postmodernism and critical theory. He points to mid-century thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who fundamentally dismantled the idea of objective truth.
Foucault argued that what we call truth is really just a function of power, right?
Right. And if a society accepts that objective evidence is just a tool of oppression, you leave a vacuum. Riker argues that once objective standards are destroyed, the natural order is replaced by the tyranny of mood.
That paints an incredibly bleak picture for his audience. If the diagnosis is that the home, the culture, the courts, and the institutions have all been captured by this feeling-based tyranny, what is the cure? How is a man supposed to navigate a society that the author believes is actively rigged against his psychological stability?
Well, this brings us to the final section of the book, which reads like a field manual for reclamation.
And what does that manual say?
Riker's solution is absolute internal sovereignty. He argues that men must become what he calls the immovable frame, and they do this by grounding themselves firmly in logos.
Logos being the ancient Greek principle of divine reason, order, and objective judgment.
Yes. Riker is telling his readers to completely ignore modern cultural advice and return to the foundational texts of the Western canon to find their footing.
So who does he point them toward?
He points them toward Aristotle, reminding them that virtue is not a feeling of empathy. Virtue is habituated excellence. It is what you do, not what you feel.
Okay, action over emotion.
Exactly. He brings in Thomas Aquinas and the concept of natural law, arguing that reality possesses a moral grammar that simply does not care about subjective trauma. And he heavily relies on Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust.
Right, man's search for meaning.
Right. Frankl taught that the highest driver of human life is the will to meaning, and that meaning is derived from carrying out your duty, not from chasing emotional validation.
The author crystallizes this philosophy into a practical daily exercise he calls the duty audit. He tells his male readers they must immediately stop measuring their worth by the emotional weather of their household or their workplace.
Turn off the emotional weather report.
Yeah. Instead, they need to measure themselves against a brutal binary checklist of reality. Did he execute his non-negotiable duties today? Did he provide physical protection for his family? Did he pursue excellence in his career? Did he establish order? If the answer to those questions is yes, then he is holding the frame, and the emotional projections bouncing off him are irrelevant.
It's all about becoming unshakable.
But let's look at the reality of being in the heat of an argument. If the culture, the courts, and the partner are all operating on emotional reasoning, how does a man actually fight back in the moment? When the accusations are flying, you can't exactly start quoting Thomas Aquinas.
Probably not a good idea.
Does he just dig his heels in and argue his points harder?
No, because that is exactly what the negative animus wants him to do. Arguing harder is jade. It feeds the parasite. Instead, Riker gives his audience a specific conversational tactic he calls the Socratic ladder.
How does that work?
When the accusation hits, when the partner says you are being completely controlling, he tells men never to defend their actions, instead calmly demand definitions.
So you just say, define what you mean by controlling.
That's it. You expose the fog. You ask the accuser to define their terms from first principles. By doing this, you shift the burden of proof back to where it belongs.
You're not playing their game.
Exactly. The goal of the Socratic ladder isn't to win the argument in her emotional courtroom, because you can't win a game where the referee changes the rules. The goal is to refuse to metabolize the pathology.
You are returning the projection back to the sender, completely unprocessed. You refuse to be the emotional kidney.
Riker tells his readers they need to embody a high-altitude climate, clear, cold, and sovereign. You let the storm rage outside the house, but you ensure the house itself is built on stone. You build a parallel order based on facts, duty, and reality, and you simply do not negotiate with the weather.
It is a totally uncompromising, unyielding manual for how to operate when the rules of engagement seem fundamentally broken. This has been such an intense, layered, and provocative text to explore with you. We've gone from a piece of silverware in a kitchen sink to the structural philosophy of Western institutions.
The scope of Riker's argument is vast, and it leads to a very pressing thought that I want to leave you with today.
Please go ahead.
If we take Riker's institutional critique seriously, if our major societal systems, from HR departments to university tribunals to the legal system, are increasingly operating on subjective emotional frameworks rather than objective evidence, what happens to the concept of justice in the next 50 years? Can a civilization actually survive if it entirely discards the idea of a shared, measurable reality in favor of personal, emotional truths?
That is a massive, unsettling question for you to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us and exploring the architecture of this argument. Please remember to like and subscribe to the show so you don't miss our next deep dive into the ideas shaping our world.
It's been a great discussion.
It really has. And again, if you want to read this controversial structural critique for yourself, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book. Finally, make sure to follow the author at Conrad at his Substack to read more on his ongoing analysis of these topics. Until next time, keep questioning and keep looking for the truth behind the fog.